"Ryan," I said, stepping out from the shadows at the back of the ballroom, holding a thick manila folder in my hand. My daughter was standing on the elevated stage in her beautiful ivory engagement dress. She was pale and shaking slightly, while 100 guests stared up at her in absolute, suffocating silence. "Before she smiles for your big announcement," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the massive room, "maybe you should tell her why your Arizona realtor was instructed to delay the closing on that house until after the wedding." Ryan's perfectly practiced, arrogant smile completely shattered. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost, because in that exact moment, staring at me under the bright stage lights, he finally recognized me. Not as Emily's father, as the private driver he had completely ignored for the last 2 months. 2 months earlier. "My name is Frank Dawson. I am 61 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio. For 37 years, I ran a highly successful commercial electrical contracting company. I spent my life pulling massive spools of copper wire through the dark, hidden bones of office buildings, ensuring the power flowed exactly where it was supposed to. In my profession, you learn a very fundamental truth. Bad wiring rarely sparks in front of guests. Most of the time, it hides behind the drywall, silently burning through the insulation until the entire house is at risk. When I retired a few years ago, I quickly realized I am not the kind of man who can sit on a porch and watch the grass grow. The quiet drove me crazy. So to get out of the house and stay busy, I took a part-time job driving for a high-end, private executive transportation service. It was easy work. I picked up wealthy corporate clients, drove them to the airport or their downtown offices, and kept my mouth shut. That was how I met Ryan Mercer. Ryan was 33 years old. He was a corporate development manager and financial strategist. He was handsome, impeccably groomed, and possessed the specific, unshakable confidence of a man who believed he was always the smartest person in any room he walked into. When Ryan first stepped into my car a month ago, he didn't look at me. To him, a driver was simply an extension of the steering wheel. He slid into the back seat, opened his laptop, and began making phone calls. He didn't recognize me, and I couldn't blame him. The company protocol required me to wear a black suit and a black chauffeur's cap pulled low over my forehead. Because I was driving directly into the morning glare, I always wore dark aviator sunglasses. Furthermore, I was currently in the middle of a painful, multi-month dental implant procedure, so I wore a black surgical mask to cover the swelling on my jaw. Between the hat, the glasses, and the mask, I was practically anonymous. I didn't realize who he was either, not at first. To me, he was just another generic, overconfident businessman talking loudly on a headset. It wasn't until his third week as my regular Tuesday and Thursday morning client that the pieces clicked together. I was merging onto the highway when I heard him talking to a friend on the phone about his upcoming wedding. He mentioned that his fiancée, Emily, was a school counselor in the Columbus public school system. He mentioned the specific high school she worked at. He complained, laughing dismissively, about how much time she spent worrying about kids who weren't even hers. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. My daughter, Emily, was 31 years old. She was a deeply empathetic, fiercely independent woman who absolutely loved her job as a high school counselor, and she was engaged to a financial strategist named Ryan. I was driving my future son-in-law to work. When I finished my shift that day, I went home and told my wife, Linda. We sat at the kitchen table and laughed about it. It seemed like a ridiculous, sitcom-level coincidence. "You have to tell him, Frank," Linda chuckled, pouring us coffee. "Next time he gets in the car, pull down the mask and say hello. The poor kid is going to have a heart attack." I fully intended to do exactly that. I thought it would be a funny story we could tell at the wedding reception. But as the days went on, and I continued to drive Ryan in total anonymity, my amusement slowly evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping sense of unease. When you sit in the driver's seat and observe someone who believes they are entirely unobserved, you see their truest nature. Ryan wasn't a criminal. He wasn't overtly abusive. But there were countless tiny, invisible red flags in the way he operated. I watched him berate a barista through the rolled-down window because his coffee wasn't hot enough, treating the young woman as if she were completely incompetent. I listened to his business calls. He never asked for anyone's opinion. He simply dictated outcomes. He spoke about his colleagues, his clients, and even his friends not as human beings, but as pieces on a chessboard that he was moving to his own advantage. He didn't view a relationship as a partnership. He viewed it as a management position. I knew my daughter. In her 20s, Emily had spent 3 years trapped in a deeply toxic relationship with a man who had slowly, methodically isolated her from her friends and family. It had taken her a long time to escape that situation, and even longer to rebuild her confidence. She had sworn she would never let a man control her again. She wanted to believe Ryan was different. When she brought him to our house for family dinners, Ryan played the part perfectly. He was charming, attentive, and respectful. He pulled out her chair. He asked Linda for her recipes. He asked me about my retirement. In front of us, he was the perfect gentleman. But the Ryan who sat in the back of my Lincoln was a completely different man. The tipping point occurred on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October. Ryan slid into the back seat, his expensive wool coat damp from the rain. He immediately dialed his phone, calling someone he referred to as Marcus, likely a mentor or an older colleague. "The promotion is secured," Ryan announced, his voice ringing with absolute arrogant certainty. "The Arizona office is fully on board. They are drafting the compensation package this week." I glanced in the rearview mirror. Emily had never mentioned anything about Phoenix or Arizona. As far as we knew, they were planning to buy a house in the Columbus suburbs after the wedding. "No, I haven't told Emily yet," Ryan continued, responding to a question from Marcus. He let out a soft, dismissive sigh. "She's going to push back. She's too attached to her counseling job here, and she is far too dependent on her parents. She worries way too much about her own independence." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "I'm not going to argue with her about it," Ryan said smoothly, entirely confident in his own superiority. "I'm just going to handle the logistics. Once everything is signed, I'll present it as a done deal. It's for our future. She'll thank me eventually." There was a pause as Marcus spoke. And then, Ryan delivered the 2 sentences that changed everything. "Marcus, you know how it is," Ryan chuckled softly. "Once we're married, she'll stop asking so many questions. And honestly, the farther she is from her family, the easier everything becomes." I hit the brakes harder than I intended, the Lincoln jerking slightly as we caught a red light. Ryan didn't even look up from his phone. He just stabilized his coffee cup and continued talking about real estate prices in Arizona. He didn't just want to marry my daughter. He wanted to uproot her, isolate her, strip away her support system, and mold her into a compliant accessory for his own life plan. He firmly believed that placing a wedding ring on her finger would magically erase her independence and give him the absolute right to dictate her future. I didn't turn around. I didn't rip off my mask and drag him out of the car. If I confronted him there, he would simply lie. He would tell Emily I was crazy, that I had misunderstood a business call. And because Emily wanted so desperately to trust him, she would believe him. I put the car in gear and drove him to his massive, glass-walled office building downtown. I pulled up to the curb. Ryan grabbed his briefcase, completely ignoring me, and opened the door. "See you Thursday," he said to the back of my head. "Have a good day, sir," I replied, my voice muffled by the surgical mask. He closed the door and walked away, looking like a man who owned the entire world. I sat in the idling car, watching the rain slide down the windshield. The quiet amusement I had felt weeks ago was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, heavy realization that my daughter was walking straight into a meticulously designed trap. That was the first time I wondered whether Ryan saw my daughter as a future wife or a future project. And as an electrician, I knew exactly what I had to do. I couldn't just tell my daughter the wiring was bad. I had to let him flip the switch, and I had to make sure she was standing close enough to see the sparks. The hardest part about discovering a massive structural lie is the overwhelming urge to immediately tear down the walls. When I came home that evening, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at a cold cup of coffee. I wanted to drive straight to Emily's apartment. I wanted to sit her down, look her in the eye, and tell her exactly what her fiancé had said in the back seat of my car. I wanted to warn her that the man she was planning to marry was actively orchestrating her isolation. But my wife, Linda, placed her hand over mine and stopped me. "If you go to her now, Frank," Linda said softly, her voice carrying the practical, grounding wisdom she had possessed for our entire marriage, "she isn't going to hear you. She is going to hear a father who is terrified of losing his daughter. She is going to think you are projecting her past trauma onto her current relationship. And if you push her too hard without proof, she will defend him before she hears you." I looked at Linda, the frustration burning in my chest. "He is planning to move her across the country without asking her, Linda. He's treating her like a chess piece." "I know," Linda replied, squeezing my hand. "But right now, you only have one overheard phone call. That isn't enough to break an engagement. Pay attention before you accuse anyone. Gather the facts. Protect her, but don't try to manage her life." She was right. If I walked into Emily's apartment armed with nothing but my own anxiety, I would only drive a wedge between us. I needed to see the full scope of Ryan's blueprints before I could point out the flaws. So, I kept my mouth shut. I kept my black hat pulled low. I kept my aviator sunglasses on, and I kept driving the Lincoln. Over the next 2 weeks, the back of my car essentially became Ryan Mercer's private war room. Because he believed I was deaf, dumb, or simply irrelevant, he made no effort to lower his voice or conceal his conversations. He treated the privacy glass separating the front and rear seats as an absolute sound barrier, even though the intercom channel was always quietly open on my side. I listened carefully, mentally cataloging every detail. Yes, I saw the latest listings. Ryan said to a realtor during a Thursday morning drive to the airport, "The property in Scottsdale is perfect. It's close to the new corporate headquarters. Put a tentative offer in, but stretch the closing date out to late January. I need to get through the wedding first before we finalize the relocation." He paused, listening to the realtor on the other end. "My fiancé?" Ryan chuckled, a smooth, condescending sound. "She hasn't seen the listing yet. I'm handling the real estate logistics. She's very attached to her job here in Columbus. She means well, but she struggles with the big picture. Once we're married, the move will make a lot more sense to her. It's better if I just set up the foundation first." My grip on the steering wheel was so tight, my knuckles turned white under my driving gloves. When we reached the airport, Ryan grabbed his luggage and hurried out of the car, completely ignoring me as usual. But as I turned to wipe down the leather back seat before my next client, I noticed something lying on the floor mat. It was a folded piece of paper that had slipped out of his expensive leather portfolio. I picked it up. It wasn't a stray receipt. It was a printed corporate email, *subject, Executive Relocation Package, Mercer, Ryan, Phoenix. The email detailed his start date in the Arizona office, a generous housing stipend, and a signing bonus. The offer had been formally accepted 2 weeks ago. I pulled out my phone and took a clear photograph of the document before folding it exactly as I found it and sliding it into the side pocket of his door for him to find later. I wasn't just relying on overheard conversations anymore. I was collecting physical blueprints. He wasn't just considering a job offer in Phoenix. He was actively bidding on real estate, locking in a cross-country move, and isolating Emily from the process, simply because he believed her opinions were an obstacle to be bypassed, rather than a partnership to be respected. That weekend, Emily came over for our usual Sunday family dinner. She looked radiant. She was exhausted from a long week at the high school. She had spent 3 days helping a struggling senior secure a community college scholarship. But she was glowing with the specific, undeniable happiness of a woman planning her wedding. While Linda was in the kitchen, I sat on the back porch with Emily, watching the autumn leaves fall into the yard. I handed her a glass of iced tea. "You look happy, Em," I said gently. "I am, Dad," she smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "The wedding planning is stressful, but Ryan has been amazing. He's taking care of so many of the little details so I can focus on work. I really think I got it right this time." It broke my heart to hear the quiet relief in her voice. She was referencing her past, acknowledging the toxic relationship she had barely survived in her 20s. She wanted so desperately for Ryan to be the safe harbor she deserved. I took a slow breath, deciding to test the waters. "Have you guys thought about where you want to settle down after the wedding?" I asked casually, keeping my tone light and conversational. "Are you two staying in Columbus?" Emily laughed, as if the question itself was slightly ridiculous. "Of course we are, Dad," she said, without a moment's hesitation. "My whole life is here. The kids at the high school need me, and Ryan knows how important my career is. We've been looking at some nice neighborhoods out near Dublin. He actually said he was going to handle the realtor contacts next week." I nodded slowly, taking a sip of my iced tea. She wasn't lying to me. She was completely, blissfully in the dark. Ryan was letting her look at suburban houses in Ohio while he secretly drafted purchase agreements in Arizona. He was intentionally feeding her false information to keep her pacified until the wedding ring was securely on her finger. The anger flared up inside me, hot and sharp, but I forced it down. I couldn't say anything. Not yet. But the hardest part of the next few weeks wasn't the anger. It was the confusion. If Ryan had been a cartoonish villain, a verbally abusive monster who constantly belittled my daughter, this would have been easy. I would have dragged him out of my car and ended it immediately. But a few days later, while I was driving him through downtown Columbus in the pouring rain, Ryan's phone rang. The Bluetooth system in the back of the Lincoln automatically connected, and I heard Emily's voice filter clearly through the speakers. "Hey," she said, sounding tired. "I'm sorry to bother you at work. It's just, one of my students dropped out today. The one I spent 3 months counseling. I just feel like I failed him." I braced myself, expecting Ryan to dismiss her feelings, to tell her that her job didn't matter, or to rush her off the phone. But he didn't. Ryan's entire demeanor softened. The arrogant corporate shark vanished. Sweetheart, listen to me," Ryan said, his voice incredibly gentle and genuinely warm. "You did not fail him. You fought for that kid harder than anyone else in his entire life. You are the most dedicated, compassionate woman I know. Some things are just outside of your control, okay? You can't save everyone. But you saved his chance, and that matters." Emily sniffled on the other end of the line. "Thank you. I just needed to hear your voice." "I love you," Ryan said, a genuine, undeniable warmth in his tone. "I'm going to pick up that awful vegan Thai food you love on the way home, okay? We'll watch a movie. Just relax." When the call ended, Ryan sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window at the rain. He didn't look like a manipulator. He looked like a man who genuinely cared about his fiancé's terrible day. That night, sitting on the edge of the bed, I told Linda what I had heard. I felt entirely unbalanced. "I don't understand it," I admitted, rubbing my tired eyes. "He was so kind to her. He sounded like a perfect husband. He really does love her, Linda. I can hear it." Linda stopped brushing her hair and looked at me through the vanity mirror. Her expression was deeply sad but entirely clear. "Maybe he does love her, Frank," Linda said softly. "But love without respect can still become control. You can love a bird, Frank. You can build it the most beautiful, expensive cage in the world. You can feed it the best seeds and speak to it gently every single day. But if you are the one locking the door so it can't fly away, you don't view it as a partner. You view it as a pet. Her words hit me like a physical blow. It was the absolute undeniable truth of the situation. The next morning, Ryan was back in the Lincoln. The compassionate fiancé from the phone call was gone, replaced once again by the cold, calculating architect of his own perfect future. The relocation package is finalized, Ryan told his colleague over the phone as we cruised down the highway. I'll announce the move to Emily at the engagement party next month. It'll be a huge surprise for her. Are you sure she's going to be okay with it? The colleague asked hesitantly. She'll be fine, Ryan replied smoothly, completely unbothered. She doesn't know what she wants right now because she's too emotional about her job. I'm providing clarity. I'm giving her a life she couldn't build on her own. She'll thank me eventually. I stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't want to hurt her. He simply believed, down to his very core, that his vision for her life was vastly superior to her own. He viewed her independence not as a strength to be celebrated, but as an inconvenience to be managed. He loved her, but he did not respect her right to choose. And as long as he held all the blueprints, Emily would never realize she was walking into a cage until the door locked behind her. I needed to find the rest of the blueprints, and I needed to put them directly into my daughter's hands. The most dangerous secrets in a relationship are rarely the ones spoken in anger. They are the ones spoken in a perfectly calm, professional tone of voice. It was the first week of November. The morning air in Columbus was sharp and freezing, but inside the heavy, insulated cabin of the Lincoln, the climate control kept the temperature at a perfect 70 degrees. Ryan was sitting in the back, messing with his new AirPods. He was trying to check his voicemail, but he hadn't fully unpaired from the Lincoln's main Bluetooth system. He tapped his phone, and a crisp, professional voice suddenly echoed through the heavy surround sound speakers of my car. "Ryan, it's Charles," the voice said. I recognized the name. It was the senior partner at the corporate law firm his company retained. "I'm leaving this voicemail to confirm the asset protection clauses in the prenuptial agreement look solid. I tightened the language regarding future, unrealized equity gains. Since you mentioned Emily will likely transition out of her counseling role in the next 2 years, and her earning potential will drop to 0. This ensures your wealth won't be diluted by alimony claims based on an artificial standard of living." Ryan cursed under his breath, frantically tapping his phone screen to disconnect the audio from the car speakers. "I strongly advise," the voicemail continued through the speakers, "that you do not present this document to her until we are much closer to the wedding. Keep her distracted with the venue details so she doesn't overthink the logistics." The audio cut out with a sharp beep as Ryan finally managed to sever the Bluetooth connection. He didn't apologize to me. He didn't even look up to see if the driver had heard. To him, the car was just a machine, and I was just another mechanical component that happened to be in the room. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather creaking softly under the pressure. I quickly pulled out a small notepad I kept in the center console and jotted down the name of the law firm and the exact time of the call. I was gathering the facts. He had just casually predicted the end of my daughter's career. Emily had spent 6 years earning her master's degree in counseling. She loved her students. She had never, not once, mentioned any desire to quit working and become a stay-at-home mother. Ryan hadn't asked her what she wanted to do. He had simply decided that her career was financially insignificant, and he was already drawing up legal documents to insulate himself from the consequences of the life he was forcing upon her. That evening, I drove straight to Emily's apartment. I told myself I was just going to check in on her. I told myself I was going to be subtle, to ask gentle questions and see if Ryan had mentioned anything about their financial future. But when I walked into her small, cozy living room and saw her sitting on the floor, surrounded by wedding invitation samples, The protective instincts of a father completely overrode my common sense. "Hey, Dad," she smiled, holding up two different shades of ivory cardstock. "Which one do you think looks better?" Ryan said he didn't care, but I feel like the textured one looks more elegant. I looked at the invitations. All I could think about was the trap door. "They both look nice, Em," I said, sitting down on the edge of the sofa. I took a deep breath. "Listen, sweetheart. Have you and Ryan sat down and had a serious conversation about the financial side of the marriage? Joint accounts, long-term planning, that sort of thing?" Emily lowered the invitations. The smile on her face faltered, replaced by a subtle, guarded look. "We've talked about it a little," she said cautiously. "Ryan handles most of the big financial stuff. He's a strategist, Dad. It's literally his job." "Why are you asking?" "I'm just asking because marriage is a partnership," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And sometimes successful guys like Ryan, they want to protect their assets. Have you guys talked about a prenup?" Emily's posture instantly stiffened. The guarded look vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp defensiveness. "A prenup?" she repeated, her tone hardening. "No, we haven't. Because we don't need one. We're building a life together, not preparing for a divorce." "I know, honey." I backpedaled quickly, realizing I had stepped on a landmine. "But it's just something you should be aware of. You need to protect yourself, too. You have your career, your retirement." "My career?" Emily interrupted, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Dad, Ryan makes 5 times what I make. He's not after my teacher's pension. He respects what I do. He's proud of me." I'm not saying he isn't proud of you, Em," I said, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts. "I'm just saying you need to be involved in the big decisions. You can't just let him drive the car while you sit in the passenger seat blindfolded." Emily stood up. She dropped the wedding invitations onto the coffee table. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and deep, profound hurt. "Doing what?" I asked, standing up as well. "Waiting for it to fail," she shouted, tears welling up in her eyes. "Every time something good happens in my life, you start waiting for it to fall apart. I know I made a mistake in my 20s, Dad. I know my last relationship was a disaster. But Ryan isn't him. Ryan loves me. He takes care of me. And instead of being happy for me, you come in here and start interrogating me about prenups and financial traps." "Emily, you aren't listening to me," I pleaded, stepping toward her. "I'm just trying to make sure you have all the facts before you sign your life away." "I have the facts," she fired back, stepping away from me. "The fact is that I finally found a man who treats me well. And my own father doesn't trust my judgment enough to support me. I'm 31 years old, Dad. Stop trying to rescue me from a fire that doesn't exist." She turned her back to me and walked into the kitchen. The conversation was over. I had pushed too hard. Just as Linda had warned, the moment I challenged Ryan's character, Emily's trauma response kicked in. She interpreted my concern as a total lack of faith in her ability to choose a good partner. She wasn't defending Ryan. She was defending her own autonomy. I walked out of her apartment with a heavy, sickening weight in my chest. For the next 2 weeks, Emily and I didn't speak. She didn't come to Sunday dinner. She didn't return my phone calls. Linda tried to bridge the gap, but Emily told her she needed space from my paranoia. I had never felt so entirely helpless in my entire life. I sat in the garage one night, staring blankly at my workbench, surrounded by old spools of wire and circuit testers. Linda walked out, carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. She set one down on the bench in front of me and pulled up a stool. "You pushed her," Linda stated quietly. It wasn't a question. "I couldn't help it, Linda," I admitted, rubbing my face in exhaustion. "He's planning to force a prenup on her, right before the wedding. He's already written off her career." I had to say something. "And what did saying something accomplish?" Linda asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Now she's angry with you, and she's leaning closer to him for support. You played right into his hands, Frank. Ryan wants her isolated. By fighting with her, you are doing his job for him. I looked down at my calloused hands. So what do I do? Just let her marry him? Let him move her to Arizona and lock her in a gilded cage? No, Linda said, her eyes locking onto mine. You stop acting out of fear, and you start acting like the man I married. You are a contractor, Frank. You don't build a case on emotion. You build it on proof. You need facts, not fear. She was right. I couldn't convince Emily with warnings and hypotheticals. I couldn't just tell her that Ryan was a controlling manipulator, because Ryan had spent a year perfectly masking his true nature in front of her. If I told her Ryan was building her future without her, she would defend him. So I needed Ryan to show her himself. I needed to gather the blueprints, the signed contracts, the hidden wiring of his grand design. And I needed to present them to her not as an angry father, but as undeniable, objective evidence. The next morning, I put on my black chauffeur's cap. I slid my aviator sunglasses over my eyes. I secured the black surgical mask over my face. I got into the driver's seat of the Lincoln, turned the ignition, and drove downtown to pick up my daughter's fiancé. I was done arguing. I was going to let Ryan Mercer talk, and I was going to write down every single word. There is a specific, deeply unsettling kind of cruelty in a man who weaponizes a celebration. 2 weeks after my fight with Emily, the silence between us remained unbroken. I didn't push her. I didn't show up at her apartment unannounced. I simply put on my uniform, secured my black mask, and continued driving the Lincoln, waiting for Ryan Mercer to reveal the final phase of his plan. I didn't have to wait long. It was a crisp, clear Thursday morning in late November. Ryan practically vibrated with energy as he slid into the back seat. He was wearing a brand new, tailored charcoal suit. And before I even pulled away from the curb, he was dialing his phone. The deposits are cleared, Ryan announced to whoever was on the other end of the line. I just finalized the booking at the Brookside Golf and Country Club. Tomorrow night. Nearly 100 guests RSVP'd. Her entire extended family's flying in, and a dozen of our corporate partners will be there. I kept the car moving smoothly through the downtown traffic, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. An engagement party at Brookside was an incredibly expensive affair. Emily had mentioned wanting a small, intimate dinner with just immediate family to celebrate their engagement. Ryan clearly had other plans. Yes, the Phoenix office relocation is completely locked in, Ryan continued, his voice brimming with absolute, supreme confidence. I've decided I'm going to make the announcement during the main toast tomorrow night. I felt a sudden, sharp chill radiate down my spine. It's perfect timing, Ryan laughed, leaning back against the leather seat. It'll be a massive surprise. Once she hears it in front of everyone, the partners, her parents, her friends, she'll understand how serious I am about our future. It's a grand, romantic gesture. He paused, listening to his colleague for a moment. Pushback, Ryan scoffed lightly. No, she won't push back. She won't say no in front of both families. She's too polite to cause a scene at her own engagement party. By the time the weekend is over, she'll have processed the move, and she'll realize it's exactly what she needs. It just expedites the transition out of her counseling job. My hands felt completely numb on the steering wheel. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a psychological ambush. Ryan knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Emily loved her life in Columbus. He knew she would fight to keep her job and her independence if they discussed the move in private. So, instead of having a difficult conversation with his future wife, he had decided to corner her. He was going to put her on a stage in front of 100 people, shine a spotlight on her, and force her to smile and nod while he unilaterally dismantled her entire life. He was using social pressure as a weapon to secure her compliance. I dropped Ryan off at his office building. For the rest of the day, I drove my other clients in a daze, my mind racing through dozens of different, highly destructive scenarios. That evening, I didn't go home. I drove the Lincoln to a quiet, dimly lit diner on the edge of town and slid into a back booth across from Gary Wallace. Gary and I had been friends for 30 years. He was a retired Columbus police detective, a man who had spent his entire career untangling domestic disputes and violent lies. He sat across from me, nursing a black coffee, listening quietly as I laid out every single detail of Ryan's grand design. When I finished, Gary didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the salt shaker on the table. "If you go into that country club tomorrow night and start throwing punches, Frank," Gary said finally, his voice low and gravelly, "you are going to lose her forever. Ryan will play the victim. He will look at Emily, bleeding on the floor, and he will tell her that her father is unhinged, and she will believe him because he just threw her a massive, expensive party. So what do I do?" I asked, the frustration threatening to boil over. "I can't let him ambush her." "You don't need proof that Ryan is evil, Frank," Gary said, tapping his thick finger on the diner table. "Evil is subjective. To Ryan, he's being a visionary. You need proof that Emily isn't getting the full story. You need objective, undeniable facts that completely contradict the reality she thinks she is living in." Gary was right. As a contractor, I knew that you couldn't just tell an inspector the wiring was dangerous. You had to show him the blueprints. You had to point the flashlight directly at the burnt insulation. I spent the next 24 hours gathering the blueprints. I didn't do anything illegal. I didn't hack Ryan's phone or hire a private investigator to break into his office. I simply used the pieces he had carelessly scattered in the back seat of my car over the last 2 months. I went online and pulled the public commercial real estate listings for the Scottsdale properties he had discussed on the phone, printing out the property history that showed tentative offers placed in his name. I printed the public press release from his company announcing the expansion of the Phoenix corporate office, noting the exact date he had accepted the relocation package, a date that was nearly 6 weeks ago. I wrote out a meticulous, detailed timeline. I documented the exact dates and times he had discussed the prenuptial agreement with his attorney. I wrote down the exact quotes regarding his expectation that Emily would quit her job. I organized the timeline and the printed documents into a neat, professional Manila folder. It wasn't a criminal dossier. It was simply the structural reality of the life Ryan was building behind her back. On Friday morning, I picked Ryan up for his final ride of the week. He was in an incredibly good mood. The culmination of his perfect plan was only hours away. As we cruised down the highway, he finished his calls early and actually leaned forward, addressing me directly for the first time in months. "You married, driver?" Ryan asked casually, looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. I kept my eyes on the road. The black surgical mask covered the lower half of my face. "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice steady. 35 years. Ryan raised an eyebrow, mildly impressed. 35 years. That's a long time. I'm getting married soon myself. Any advice for a guy about to take the plunge? He wasn't actually asking for advice. He was simply making conversation with the furniture, basking in his own successful glow. I looked at him in the mirror. I thought about the Manila folder sitting on the passenger seat next to me. "Listen more than you talk," I said quietly. "If you don't listen to your partner, you might end up building a house she doesn't want to live in." Ryan chuckled, a smooth, polished sound of amusement. "That's good advice," he said, entirely missing the point. "But sometimes, a good architect just has to build the house and trust that they'll love the view once they move in." He leaned back in his seat, completely satisfied with his own metaphor. He spent the rest of the drive looking at his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that the man driving him was the architect he was about to go to war with. I dropped him off at his office. He didn't say goodbye. He just grabbed his briefcase and walked away, eager to start the final countdown to his perfect evening. I drove back to the transportation hub, parked the Lincoln, and handed the keys to the dispatcher. I took off the chauffeur's cap. I took off the aviator sunglasses. Finally, I pulled the black surgical mask off my face, throwing it into the trash can. I drove my personal truck back to my house. Linda was waiting for me in the kitchen. My dark navy suit was already pressed and hanging on the door. "Are you ready?" Linda asked softly, looking at the manila folder in my hand. "I am," I replied. The next day, Ryan Mercer planned to unveil the grand, spectacular future he had designed for my daughter. He planned to use 100 guests to force her into a corner she couldn't escape from. He had absolutely no idea that I was bringing the missing blueprints. The Brookside Golf and Country Club was exactly the kind of venue a man like Ryan Mercer would choose to showcase his own success. When Linda and I walked into the main ballroom on Saturday evening, the sheer scale of the event was overwhelming. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the manicured, rolling greens of the golf course, illuminated by soft amber landscape lighting. A professional string quartet played classical music near the entrance. Dozens of round tables were draped in heavy white linen and covered with massive, expensive floral arrangements. Nearly 100 guests, partners from Ryan's firm, old college friends, and our extended family, mingled in their expensive evening wear, drinking champagne from crystal flutes. It didn't feel like an engagement party. It felt like a corporate summit. I stood near the back of the room by the heavy oak bar, my dark navy suit blending into the shadows, gripping the thick manila folder in my left hand. Across the room, Emily was standing with a group of her friends. She looked absolutely breathtaking in a simple, elegant ivory dress. She was laughing, a bright, genuine sound that floated over the noise of the crowd. She looked incredibly, undeniably happy. Watching her smile, a sudden, heavy wave of doubt crashed over me. If I walked forward and opened this folder, I was going to completely obliterate that smile. I was going to humiliate her in front of 100 people. I was going to destroy the wedding she had been planning for months. And there was a very real possibility that she would never forgive me for doing it in such a spectacular, public fashion. I looked at Linda, who was standing quietly beside me. She saw the hesitation in my eyes. "It's a beautiful house, Frank," Linda said softly, following my gaze to where Emily was standing. "But it's built on a sinkhole. If you don't show her the cracks now, it's going to collapse on top of her after the wedding. You aren't ruining her happiness, you are saving her life." I took a slow, deep breath, anchoring myself to her words. I tightened my grip on the manila folder. At exactly 8 o'clock, the string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded as a man tapped a spoon against a champagne glass. Ryan stepped up onto the small, elevated stage at the front of the ballroom, holding a microphone. He looked perfect. His tailored suit caught the light, and his smile was a flawless, practiced expression of genuine warmth. He reached out and pulled Emily up onto the stage next to him, wrapping his arm securely around her waist. "Thank you," Ryan began, his voice smooth and resonant, echoing perfectly through the ballroom's sound system. "Thank you all for being here tonight. When I look around this room, I see family. I see mentors. I see the people who have supported us, guided us, and helped us reach this incredible milestone." The crowd murmured warmly. Ryan was a masterful public speaker. He knew exactly how to pace his words, how to make eye contact with key individuals in the audience, and how to project the image of a humble, grateful leader. "Marriage," Ryan continued, looking down at Emily with a look of profound, manufactured devotion, "is about commitment, but it is also about vision. It is about making bold decisions, trusting your partner, and stepping into the future together, even when that future requires us to leave our comfort zones behind." Emily smiled up at him, her eyes shining with absolute trust. She thought he was speaking metaphorically about the emotional journey of marriage. I knew he was talking about real estate. "Over the last year," Ryan said, turning his attention back to the crowd, his voice rising with triumphant energy, "Emily has been my rock, and as my career takes this next massive step, I know she will continue to be my foundation, which is why I am so incredibly thrilled to announce tonight, surrounded by the people we love most, that Emily and I are excited to begin our next chapter together. In Phoenix, Arizona. Ryan raised his champagne flute in the air, waiting for the applause. It started immediately. The corporate partners from his firm, who already knew about the relocation, clapped loudly and cheered. The rest of the room joined in, a polite, rolling wave of applause carrying through the ballroom. But the applause didn't last. It faltered, rippling unevenly across the room before dying out entirely. The guests who were clapping had looked up at the stage and noticed something very wrong. Emily wasn't smiling. She wasn't blushing or laughing at the surprise. She was staring at Ryan, her face completely blank, the color rapidly draining from her cheeks. The heavy, suffocating silence of absolute confusion settled over the massive ballroom. Emily slowly reached out and pulled the microphone slightly toward her. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but because she was speaking directly into the microphone, the words echoed sharply off the back walls. Ryan's flawless smile slipped for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to speak. He had calculated that the social pressure of 100 staring eyes would paralyze her, forcing her to play along until they were in private. But Emily had survived a controlling relationship before. Her instincts, buried deep beneath her love for him, had instantly recognized the cold metal of a trap snapping shut. "The move, honey," Ryan chuckled, trying desperately to project a tone of light-hearted reassurance to the crowd. He pulled her closer to his side, tightening his grip on her waist. "The corporate expansion. We talked about how great the weather would be down there." "What move, Ryan?" Emily repeated, her voice hardening, refusing to be placated. She stepped out of his grip, creating a physical distance between them on the stage. "We were looking at houses in Dublin. When did we decide to move to Phoenix?" The silence in the room was now absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 100 guests were collectively holding their breath, witnessing the live, structural collapse of a relationship. Ryan looked around the room, panic finally breaking through his polished exterior. He realized he was losing control of the narrative. The public ambush had failed. He needed to reassert his authority immediately. "Emily, this isn't the time," Ryan hissed softly, leaning in, though the microphone still caught the sharp, commanding edge of his voice. "I secured the relocation package. It's an incredible opportunity for us. We can discuss the specific logistics later. Just smile for now." "I don't want to smile," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly, but holding firm. "I want to know when you accepted a job across the country without asking me. I am the one who handles the career trajectory, Emily." Ryan snapped, the frustration finally fracturing his carefully constructed mask. "I made a decision for our future. Why are you acting like this is a tragedy?" "Because it is a tragedy, Ryan." My voice cut through the silence like a gunshot. I didn't yell, but years of working on loud, chaotic construction sites had taught me how to project my voice from my chest. Every single head in the massive ballroom snapped toward the back of the room. I stepped out of the shadows near the bar and began walking slowly down the center aisle, directly toward the stage. Ryan squinted, peering through the glare of the stage lights, trying to identify the man interrupting his party. He recognized my face as Emily's father, of course. But as I walked closer, my posture stiff and my eyes locked onto his, another, deeply terrifying recognition clicked into place in his mind. He recognized the shape of my shoulders. He recognized the specific cadence of my voice. He had spent the last 2 months sitting 3 feet behind me in a confined space. He hadn't known my face, but his subconscious had memorized my physical presence. Ryan took a slow step backward on the stage, his eyes widening in absolute horror. "Frank?" Ryan breathed, the microphone picking up the sudden, ragged panic in his voice. I stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at him. I held up the thick manila folder. Yeah, Ryan, I said, my voice perfectly cold. The driver, the silence in the ballroom was absolute. 100 people stood frozen in their expensive clothes, watching the immaculate facade of Ryan Mercer's life crack and splinter under the bright stage lights. Ryan stared down at me from the elevated platform, his mind desperately trying to reconcile two completely different realities. To him, I was Emily's overprotective, blue-collar father. But I was also the invisible, silent driver who had spent the last 2 months absorbing every single secret he had spoken into his cell phone. Frank, Ryan stammered, attempting to recover his composure. He tried to force a condescending, placating smile onto his face, but his eyes were wide with genuine panic. I don't know what you're doing, but this is wildly inappropriate. You're ruining your daughter's engagement party. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step up onto the stage and try to physically intimidate him. I didn't need to. I had the blueprints. I turned away from Ryan and looked directly at my daughter. She was standing a few feet away from him, her hands trembling, her eyes searching my face for an explanation. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I said, my voice steady and calm. But before anyone applauds another surprise tonight, I think you deserve to know exactly what you are applauding. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage and looked back up at Ryan. When did you tell her about the job offer in Phoenix, Ryan? I asked clearly, the words echoing through the silent room. Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. When did you tell her about the realtor you hired in Arizona? I continued, taking another step forward. When did you tell her that you instructed that realtor to delay the closing until after the wedding, so you could secure the property without her input? Emily let out a sharp, ragged breath. She looked at Ryan, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to call me crazy. But Ryan couldn't speak. He was trapped in the headlights, realizing with terrifying clarity that I had heard every single word of his private conversations. When did you tell her about the prenuptial agreement, Ryan? I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. The one you told your lawyer you were going to hide from her until the very last minute, so she would be too distracted by the wedding to read it properly. Stop it, Ryan hissed, his voice dropping into a desperate, furious whisper. You are taking things out of context. You don't understand corporate logistics. I understand exactly what you are building, I replied coldly. I looked back at Emily. When did he tell you, Emily? When did he tell you that he expects you to quit your counseling job within 2 years because it doesn't make enough money to matter? When did he tell you that your independence was a flaw that he needed to fix? Emily didn't cry. The shock had completely burned away her tears. She walked slowly to the edge of the stage, knelt down, and reached out her hand. I placed the thick manila folder into her palm. She stood up, opened the folder, and began to read. The room was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the heavy paper. She saw the printed public press release confirming his promotion 6 weeks ago. She saw the commercial real estate listings in Scottsdale. She saw the meticulous timeline of his calls with the corporate attorney regarding the prenup. It was undeniable, structural proof that the man standing next to her had been actively constructing a cage around her life. Emily, listen to me, Ryan pleaded, stepping toward her, his hands raised in a desperate gesture of surrender. He doesn't understand. I was trying to give you everything. I was trying to build a life for us where you wouldn't have to worry about anything. It was supposed to be romantic. Emily looked up from the folder. The woman who had spent the last year desperately wanting to believe in him was entirely gone. In her place was the fiercely independent, deeply empathetic counselor who spent her life teaching high school students how to recognize toxic behavior. A surprise dinner is romantic, Ryan, Emily said, her voice shaking with a quiet, devastating anger. Moving me across the country without asking me is not romantic. It's a kidnapping. That's not fair, Ryan protested, his voice cracking. He looked around the room, silently begging his corporate partners and friends for support, but they were all staring at the floor, mortified. He realized the crowd wasn't going to save him. He turned back to Emily, his tone shifting into something sharper and more defensive. "Emily, look at what is happening," Ryan said, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Your father has been spying on us. He's been tracking my calls. He's trying to manipulate you because he's terrified of losing you. This is exactly what I meant. Your family is trying to control you." Emily looked down at the manila folder in her hands, then slowly looked back up at Ryan. "No, Ryan," Emily said, her voice perfectly steady. "My father handed me information. You made decisions for me." She closed the folder. "You kept calling it our future," Emily said, looking him dead in the eye. "But every single decision belonged to you. You didn't want a partner, Ryan. You wanted a passenger." She reached down to her left hand. The engagement ring Ryan had bought her was stunning. It was a massive, flawless diamond set in platinum, a ring designed to impress everyone who saw it. It was heavy. It was expensive. Emily pulled the ring off her finger. Ryan froze. "Emily, don't, please. We can talk about this. We can fix it." "You didn't love me, Ryan," Emily said softly, the absolute finality in her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "You loved the version of me that fit perfectly inside your plan." She held her hand out. Ryan didn't move. He couldn't. His entire reality, his supreme confidence, his meticulous planning, his absolute belief that he was the smartest man in the room, had completely shattered. Emily dropped the heavy diamond ring onto the wooden stage. It landed with a sharp, clear click that sounded like a lock snapping open. She turned around, holding the manila folder against her chest, and walked down the steps of the stage. There were no screaming matches. There were no dramatic arrests. No one threw a punch and no one called the police. The revenge was entirely bloodless, but it was absolute. Ryan Mercer was left standing alone on a brightly lit stage in front of his bosses, his colleagues and his friends, stripped of his control and exposed for exactly what he was. He didn't try to stop her as she walked down the center aisle. He simply stood there, staring at the ring on the floor, watching the future he had designed evaporate into thin air. As Emily reached the back of the room where I was standing, I didn't reach out and hug her. I didn't tell her I was right. I didn't try to manage her emotions or dictate her next steps. I stepped back, giving her the physical and emotional space she needed. For the first time in months, Ryan Mercer was completely silent. And for the first time in months, my daughter was the only person deciding what happened next. The aftermath of an earthquake is never clean. Even after the ground stops shaking, you still have to deal with the rubble. The weeks following the engagement party were some of the hardest of my entire life. When the adrenaline faded and the shock wore off, Emily was left to process the sheer, humiliating magnitude of what had happened. She was angry at Ryan, of course, but she was also deeply, profoundly angry with me. She felt exposed. She felt like I had been spying on her, tracking her relationship like a detective rather than a father. She was humiliated that I had held on to the secret for 2 months, allowing her to plan a wedding to a man who was actively dismantling her life. She didn't speak to me for a month. I didn't push her. I didn't show up at her apartment demanding gratitude. I didn't try to explain my actions or justify the timeline. I simply accepted the anger. When you pull someone out of a burning house, you don't complain if they yell at you for bruising their ribs on the way out. You just thank God they are still breathing. Linda, as always, kept me grounded. "You did exactly what you needed to do, Frank," Linda told me one evening as I stared at the silent telephone in the kitchen. "You saved her from a terrible marriage, but you don't get to demand a thank you note. You gave her back her agency. Now, you have to actually let her use it. Don't try to manage her healing." So, I waited. I gave my notice to the private transportation company. I had learned everything I needed to learn from the driver's seat of that black Lincoln, and I had absolutely no desire to ever put on that chauffeur's cap again. I spent my days working in the garage, fixing old radios, letting the quiet settle back into my life. It took time, but the frost eventually began to thaw. Without Ryan's overwhelming, suffocating guidance, Emily's natural independence flooded back into her life. 6 months after the cancelled wedding, she closed on a small townhouse in a quiet Columbus neighborhood. She didn't buy it because it was a strategic financial asset. She bought it because it had a large bay window and space for a garden. She dove back into her counseling career with renewed dedication, building a house entirely of her own design. And Ryan? I never saw him again. But I heard he took the transfer to Phoenix. He moved into his massive house in Scottsdale and continued his ascent up the corporate ladder. He had everything he had ever wanted, but he was building it alone. The closure to our long, silent standoff didn't happen in a dramatic, tearful confrontation. It happened on a quiet Sunday evening in late May. Linda was in the living room reading a book. Emily and I were standing in the kitchen, washing the dishes. The rhythmic, mundane clatter of plates and silverware filled the warm, comfortable air. Emily picked up a dish towel and began drying a handful of silverware, staring out the window at the setting sun. "You were annoying, Dad," she said softly. I stopped scrubbing the pan. I didn't turn to look at her. I just stared at the soapy water in the sink. "Only annoying?" I asked, a faint smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Extremely annoying," Emily clarified, a slight tremor in her voice. "You were stubborn. You were secretive. You were incredibly frustrating." I turned the water off. The kitchen was completely silent. She set the dish towel down on the counter. She turned to look at me, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. "But," she whispered, her voice cracking just slightly. "Thank you." It was 2 words, but those 2 words held the weight of 1,000 apologies and 1,000 acts of forgiveness. She was acknowledging the terrifying truth of what Ryan had been, and she was acknowledging the painful, necessary surgical strike I had executed to save her from him. I dried my hands on a towel. I turned to my daughter, my brilliant, resilient, fiercely independent daughter, and I pulled her into a hug. She hugged me back, resting her head against my shoulder, finally letting out a long, shuddering breath. "You're welcome." "Sweetheart," I whispered into her hair, "I'm so incredibly proud of you." We stood there in the kitchen for a long time, simply holding on to the quiet, undeniable peace of a family that had survived the storm. For most of my life, I thought protecting my daughter meant stepping in front of her. I thought it meant insulating her from the world, solving her problems before they reached her, and shielding her from the consequences of bad decisions. I thought my job as a father was to build a wall around her. I was wrong. When you build a wall around someone, you aren't protecting them. You are just teaching them how to live in a cage. You are teaching them that they aren't strong enough to face the fire themselves. I learned that the hardest, most profound act of love isn't fixing the problem for them. Sometimes, protecting someone means showing them the ugly, terrifying truth. It means handing them the blueprints, stepping back, and trusting them enough to choose for themselves.